Welcome to Unmoored, America adrift in historical forgetfulness and finding our way back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Welcome back, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
We are diving into episode 7, which is going to be a continuation. I mean, all of it's a continuation. It's kind of a nice flow of trying to kind of make this point. I think short version, I'm trying to say to the person who isn't clear that what history tells us is that our founders weren't crazy when they were leaning into and building foundationally upon Christianity. That Christianity has a net positive, that modern people are not stuck with Christianity just because our founders picked it and they could have picked a bunch of stuff, but to jettison it is kind of at our peril even. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that they weren't coming up with this out of thin air, whole cloth, but they certainly weren't borrowing from the spirit of the time. They were really leaning back to biblical principles, but and then again maybe culturally borrowing some from Greek and Roman culture.
Yeah,
but reaching really far back. Yeah. Versus this is kind of the zeitgeist.
Yeah, and again, I guess the warning to everyone, myself included, is that sometimes we can feel like an aspect of our society. So I'll use an easy one, that we vote on things. We vote on things and we think, well, yeah, everybody votes on things, or all the cool countries vote on things, or voting on things are what everybody's done. And then if you study history, you're like, no, nobody does that. Like, so if I think voting on things is useful, well, I want to save that. But then that begs the next question of like, well, why should you want somebody to vote? And to just be candid for a second, I know people, I see people, I drive on our interstates, and I'm like, I hope that guy doesn't vote. Now,
yes.
So
there should be a test.
What's going on there, right? There's a human worth valuation that's happening.
Right. If we value this, and this came from these people, then what is it? What's the connection that we feel that this is right? So where did they get it from?
Right.
And wherever they got it from, maybe we shouldn't just chuck that out wholesale.
And even if you say, well, voting's a bad example, okay, so let's go to one of the things. We referenced the Declaration of Independence last time that Jefferson said. He said, right to pursue happiness. But most people who know, again, we're going to study the Declaration in a couple of episodes. We're going to go deeper on it. Know that he's leaning on John Locke. And John Locke referenced that the human has the right to life, liberty, and property,
right.
Which for Jefferson, that's what a pursuit of happiness is. Well, why should you have the right to your property? Again, no societies would say that naturally. It wasn't like they allowed for theft. It's just that it's not the normative. The normative is if I can take it from you, why wouldn't I?
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't necessarily by necessity, but that leans on from the Western or the American viewpoint of what Christianity says, that the human has worth. And if the human has worth, then she should be able to maintain her possessions without any fear from anyone else. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Anybody listening to this would say, look, we got certain rights. I can say what I want to say, make my own choices, determine my destiny. But that is appealing to some, let's say unnamed, but that there's some moral standard implicit in that. Now, what that is or where it comes from, you may discuss or disagree, but clearly there's a sense of rightness that's underneath, that undergirds that. So how is it that we all, where does that come from?
Exactly. And of course, that concern that you're raising takes back to in episode 1 when I laid out what I feel like are 3 major challenges. And the third one was coming off the first two, but particularly the second one of this hyper-individuality, the hyper-individualism stuff, that in postmodernism, well, the only thing that's right is what's right for me. So back to what you just said, where does this come from that we think that there should be, to use the example I just used, a right to property? And if you say, well, there is no foundation, or the only truth is what's true to me, or you say, I want to jettison Christianity, at least marginalize it to a very small private domain, or perhaps better, it'd be better if we didn't have it at all around, because I see it as a hindrance to flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
You're giving away the thing that gave us the foundation to say you have a right to property. And if you don't have that foundation, and then you say, I have a right to property, well, that's just your opinion.
Right. And you better have a lot of guns, because there's no moral standard for you to appeal to. If everything is relative, it's every man for himself. I don't see another way around it. I would love to see another way around it, but if everything is relative, then just anarchy, right? I don't see another scenario for it.
Yes, and I can hear some of my non-Christian friends saying, but that's where natural law will come in, or that's where the Enlightenment comes in, and we kind of dug in on that already. But even if you wanted to offer that up as your solution, that's my replacement moral virtue position. The next step that we're not going to do today, but you go past that to say, well, wait, how do I even know that that's true? In other words, the idea that the human has worth is a kind of value statement that suggests something non-human or above the human is declaring this truism. Again, if it's just me saying the human has worth based on my own opinions of niceness, then my opinion is not better than your opinion.
Right.
You could say, well, I'm glad you think that, but I don't think that. So this is really, we're maybe slightly a little off target, but I think this is a good conversation to have. This really gets into the why behind the issue, that we're really seeking, if we want the flourishing to return to society, we're seeking like a solution, or the solution to the problem of how do we operate in the world. And my suggestion is not pick a philosophy. My suggestion is that there is a real, a true story of the human species from which we need some solution provided to aspects, and we should be on the hunt for what is that solution, or where do we find the true and real story of the human. Now, I really do think I'm going to do a whole season 2 that may go down that road in more depth. We're not going to go down that road in more depth right now, but if we jettison this core aspect of our foundation for this society, we do so at our peril. Now, I can hear somebody saying, yeah, but and I've said this before in some of our data points, I know a bunch of people who claim to be Christians, and they're terrible at this.
Mm-hmm. I'm terrible at this. There's a quote, I always hear it attributed to Brennan Manning. The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And I say, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
And there is nobody more dismayed at my shortcomings than me. And you should hang out. If we should hang out. You're like, oh, geez. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Don't hear either one of us somehow posing ourselves as like the best representatives of this faith. We're seekers. We're going on a journey together.
Yeah, and there's like two things you got to hold at the same time. One is, a disappointment or dissatisfaction with people falling short of their professed ideals. Like, yeah, I get it. That's a legitimate point of view to say you are not fulfilling everything that you say you believe. At the same time, what we say we believe, there's an allowance that says that's why this is true.
Yeah.
And there's a larger story to it. So it's not just a bunch of hypocrites. It's a lot of hypocrites. It's not just a bunch of hypocrites. And there's kind of a larger story that fits within. But at the same time, not being dismissive of the fact that
Right.
you're like, you say this, you do this. You're like, yeah, that is an absolutely legitimate reaction to seeing things.
And I think for the two of us in particular, both of whom are Christians, we have said right up from the get-go, we're not approaching this in a triumphalistic point of view. We're approaching this in a humbleness. Maybe we didn't say this out loud, but certainly about our own failures to uphold the things that we believe to be true or to fall short of reaching that goal. But then also to collectively say both about the nation and about Christianity, hey, here's where the ball's been dropped. Here's where the failure has occurred. And we're not done yet, but we're pointing these things out to show that these flaws. And that then should raise the question, as I said, going into the last episode, well, then maybe we should just get rid of Christianity. Yeah, fair question. But here's the warning back to the maybe everybody I know is not doing this right argument is the fact that someone poorly represents X does not mean that X does not have merit. And this can be it could be something as simple as a sport, like, oh, I don't like this sport. I know this person who's in it, or I maybe don't understand it. Well, that doesn't mean it's the sport. Just because people you've seen do it poorly doesn't mean that it doesn't have some merit. Same thing. You used an example earlier about music.
Yeah, Steve Brown would I've heard him say, it's like hearing somebody sing your favorite song very, very poorly, and you just kind of cringe. You're like, this is terrible. But the problem is not the song. The problem is the execution of that song. We can all objectively go, that is a terrible cover, but the song stands apart from that. I mean, if you're talking about Christians, you're talking about a club, in so many words, of people. You only get admission to this club by going, I'm a screw up.
Yeah, big time.
That literally is the buy-in to this group of people to go, I don't have my stuff together. And I need help.
Yeah.
With that. That is the most honest, expression of our status. It's not good people doing good things. It's messed up people being saved.
Yeah.
And if you could come along somebody and go, hey, you struggle with that, man. You know what? I got to be honest. I do too. Then there's the identification, and maybe there's kind of some meaningful connection there.
Yeah. And I think that's so helpful as we turn in and look at some more of these factors that I really want to point out that history shows us Christianity alone provides for us. Because as you're listening to these, there's going to be different ones where you're going to think, I know Christians, or I know of Christianity today, and it doesn't do that now. Always keep in mind, we're talking about Christianity, not Christendom. We're talking about Christianity, not what Christianity becomes in what I call the warping or the devolving of Christianity post-Constantine. Remember, I'm not saying it's Constantine himself who did it, but that movement into majority culture, again, back to my Christian friends, I would just offer that you don't really want to be the majority culture. That probably should have said that another way, because it really begs a whole bunch of other questions. But I've tried to make this point. However, to my progressive friends, man, you don't want to get rid of this, because the very things you're fighting for. Well, let me just point out. Let's just dive into it. So last time, the biggest one is this. And I tell my students this all the time. We're trying to understand, why do we even have to study Western culture? Now, there's more to Western culture than Christianity. There's other parts to it. But one of the ones that I point out is that Christianity is a vital piece of Western culture, and its core contribution is that the human has worth. And then usually when we've talked about this, we'll go through this semester and we'll start with antiquity and walk our way along. And I'm like, go back and consider and just pick your group. And they're all wonderful people. They're all lovely societies. It'd be fun to visit if you could go back in Doc Brown's DeLorean. But when you get there, most people in that society, and certainly anybody not of that society, was devalued. They were, they weren't friends, and they weren't given rights, and they weren't given agency. So the Christians do that, and then they make sure to say, hey, this faith, it's open to everybody. Anybody who wants to jump in can jump in. And so we kind of looked at that as we kind of walked our way through. Well, so from that position then, there's a whole series of things that are revolutionary to the world. So here's the first one, right? That the civic structure of a society needs to reflect that the human has worth and reflect the everyone welcome. Now, it's going to take a long time from kind of Jesus to seeing this fully fleshed out. In fact, there's a whole Western history to walk through in which you could say that wasn't true in these various and sundry centuries. And to some degree, this one is the one that really is the triumph of the viewpoint in both England in the 1600s and the Americans in the 1700s with the coming of the United States in 1776 through the latter part of that century. So what I mean by that is so all the laws needed to be equal. In fact, the church going into the Middle Ages would demand a judicial oversight to ensure that equity was done, in particular to protect poor people. You see this reflected in concepts in England that certainly after the Magna Carta, that rights were a part of the individual. So if I'm alive, I have rights to being alive. Again, as Jefferson said, the right to life. That the individual should have some contribution to how society operates. You and I call that voting. Mm-hmm. That life has value, so the elimination of life, what you and I would call murder, is not to be accepted. And that is true regardless of national ethic or, racial identity. Power or wealth does not make you somehow immune to the law because we're all equal. This is a really big deal for the American founders. There's this mutual agreement to obey the law. So then I'm not going to have to need a police officer at every stop sign. That I can choose to contribute to society or not without coercion. You can't make me. And at the same time, the force of the central government cannot stop me. So we would call this the right to free speech. Free speech all hinges on the fact that the human has worth. Of course, obviously, you can't yell fire in a crowded, mm-hmm. theater, but in general, I can say what I want to say, and no one has the ability to kind of stop me from that. And then this links into economics. I'm allowed to pursue whatever I wish. I'm no longer bound by what my father and grandfather and great-grandfather before had done for the noble lord that we lived on their property. Wherever my talents are, I can go and pursue those, including the owning of property then after that aspect. Does that kind of make sense there, kind of working your way through?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it colors everything. And again, like kind of what you said before, if you're like, let's just take Christianity out of our American way of life, you're zeroing out way more than
Absolutely.
You have any idea.
Yeah. There's no reason to let anybody vote. There's no reason to say you have a right to life. All these things beg something as a foundation, as we were saying earlier. Well, here's another one. This one's near and dear to my heart because, well, for a lot of reasons. And we've talked about this before. In ancient society, and in fact, arguably through much of the world society, women have consistently been devalued. In Christianity, women were seen as equal. They were to be included in social, cultural, leadership life. They were welcomed into the society. In most other settings you can examine, women were tolerated. They weren't included. They were often a woman, and we both have daughters. The daughter, we would have been sort of happy to have a daughter, maybe not, maybe sort of, but we would see the value of the daughter only in what she provided to me as a bargaining chip, as a way to get kind of economic advantage. In no way capacity of value to the male. A woman was not allowed to testify in court in most societies. You would see this bargaining both at the private level, like I'm trying to have a relationship with another business person, so I offer my daughter as someone for his son, but also obviously more famously at the national level, like the linking of kingdoms and tribes through a marriage. At no point is the woman like included in this.
Yeah.
Now, I can hear most of you already screaming through the radio. This is probably the one that I think Americans and American Christians and American Christianity has failed at the greatest. We have lived out more the post-Constantine Christianity that we talked about, where women were marginalized and shunted off. Although even in that, as I'm going to show you, there's a couple of places where you still go, oh, well, there still was some kind of a more liberal stance for women, but still, for myself, I tell my students, I'm a pretty hardcore feminist. I don't think there's certainly some variations on feminism where they would say no way, because I can be conservative in my faith and in other expressions. But I think when I think about Constantine, this is probably and what happened post Constantine. This is the thing that makes me the saddest, is that when you read the ancient sources, women, as I just said to you, women were included in a way. In fact, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the ancient documents telling us about this guy Jesus, who we're very confident about, but obviously the idea that he was a human and then died and resurrected is the most extravagant claim. And we're not going to debate that. But when you say, what's the evidence for that? And you're looking, and trust me, the historical evidence is astounding. But one of the most important pieces is that the testimony of this group was on women. Meaning, if you were making a story up in this context, the last people you would ever say, oh, we have a witness, would have been a woman. So it makes me very sad that women kind of had the treatment that they've had. And certainly it's lasted for 2,000 years. And I personally am glad for a lot of the changes that we've seen in my lifetime. I would wish for some others to continue to happen. I probably should stop before I say something. Get me in trouble.
But yeah, if anybody is interested in what the Bible says about the treatment of women, if you read it in whole, you're gonna. I think you're gonna be surprised.
Well, and along those lines, so I just mentioned marriage. So marriage is another thing. Again, most people think today of marriage in terms of romantic love and some kind of a lifetime commitment of love and cherishment and all this kind of stuff. And that is a full-on Christian concept. That just does not, you cannot find that in any society pre-Christianity. Marriage was a contract. The woman had no voice in the matter. Christians came into this, and there was this elevation I mentioned last time or a couple of times ago. The guy Paul that I mentioned before, he says, hey, look, men, you're going to submit one to another. And then he gives this very elaborate kind of construction of what a marriage would be, where the man's ready to live his life in a way that he gives up his life, even to death, for the wife. If you'd gone to some other people group, go to Carthage, go to Persia, go to the Russian steppes, and you'd said, hey, this is what it's a relationship. You would have been like, no, not doing that. This is why, for the Christians, marriage became monogamous. You do have monogamous relationships in other pre-Christian societies, but you also, as we said last time, had a fairly fluid sense of I can have sex with whoever I want to, and the woman's opinion on the matter doesn't matter. I'm going to kind of be able to do what I want to do. So here you have this situation where the marriage is of two equal partners. Now, there still will be contracted or arranged marriages, and it's not clear the Bible was saying that necessarily shouldn't have happened, but you begin to move down this road to where if the woman has equal status and is a person of worth, then she should have some insight or contribution as to whether she wants to partner in this situation. Flip that around, another aspect that the Christians began to argue for was to make divorce very difficult. Remember I said earlier about the church in the Middle Ages kind of stepping into the judicial side of things. One of the things was that they managed this whole concept. Most famously, obviously, the King of England, Henry VIII, wanting to separate from his wife, he had to get permission. Not because he was the king. In a sense, yes, because he was the king, he went to the Pope. But this sense of you can't just throw your wife away. And in most societies throughout history, you could, because she really was property. A man had very little limits as to how he disposed of his property, including his wife, including his children. And I mentioned Nietzsche last time. This is another place where Nietzsche really hated Christianity because he felt like this emasculated men, that it made them weak to say that they were equal to women, that they somehow had to be concerned about how children were treated, that they couldn't abandon their children, they couldn't abandon their wife. For Nietzsche, he's like, no, the male is dominant, hence his idea of the Übermenschen, the superhuman male. And he means that in a male-centric way, not in a man used to mean humans, all of us, kind of a thing.
Sounds like a fun guy.
Well, I mean, I think Nietzsche is a voice taking both Christianity as he finds it, but also the Enlightenment as he finds it in the late 19th century to task, as someone who's looking back to saying, I wish I lived in a pre-Christian society. So when you're reading Nietzsche, and his point then in that world becomes nihilistic, but then in a nihilistic world that's not doom and gloom, it's take what you can. You're the powerful, be the powerful. Right. I mean, I don't want to live in that world.
Yeah.
I hope nobody else wants to live in that world. But if you don't want to live in that world, you can't take Nietzsche's path, which is we definitely must reject and eliminate Christianity. Instead, we need Christianity because of its protection for us. Okay, aid to the poor. As you said last time or earlier this session, I think, in most societies, being poor was seen as a judgment against the gods, by the gods. That you had done something. If not you, your ancestors before you. And so it's just sucks to be you. Try to live as best you can in the setting. In some religious groups that believe in a reincarnation, perhaps then you suffer through it. Maybe next time around, it'll be a little better off. Well, the Christians approach this very differently. And they went out of their way to develop aid for each other, including eventually aid beyond their own group. So there's no governing structure that says, hey, look, we should do something to aid poor people or something. And depending on who you read, 65% of Roman population in its empire was below basically poverty level or at poverty level. So the Christians, they go out of their way to go the other direction. They're selling their property so that there's ability within the church to take care of everybody. Again, as I said earlier, that's one reason perhaps maybe poor people were coming because they felt like something was taking care of them. In the 2nd century, it's been estimated in Rome alone that the church or the Christian leadership, and this is, well, don't think of this in Roman Catholicism that you know of as a religion alive today. Just think the Christians living in the city of Rome. They spent over 1 million sestertii. And I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly, but basically the Roman equivalent of money, which, long story short, it's a lot of money. They're spending a lot of money, and they get noted for this. They're basically going, wait, why are you doing this and spending this much money? And remember, we're talking about a cult, a dangerous sect, a group that's seen as this underground secret society that's a bunch of freaks. But people begin saying, wait a minute, they're actually aiding poor people. Now, they didn't all say, that's wonderful. They're like, that is so strange. But it's, as we looked at last time in some of the ancient documents, it's noted in its influence.
Yeah, it just really stands out, when you believe a lot of stuff, but if it colors how you use your money, how you view sex, those kind of things, that's going to really stand out really quickly.
Yep. They extend it to physical care. So basically, we have hospitals today because of Christians. My wife is a nurse. She works in a hospital. Thank you, Christians, because without you guys, we don't have that. The Christians began to think their care for one another extended to the physically ill. And eventually they began, not eventually, but I mean, obviously initially, because everybody hates them, they're only really sort of taking care of themselves. But as they get more and more numerous in the Roman society, they're caring for anybody who needs this. And again, this was shocking to Romans. You didn't go out of your way to care. There was no real hospitals or any kind of money spent in concern for that. If somebody was ill, then better off for the rest of us if you die. And death was around not just the Romans, certainly other societies were this way a lot, including the abandonment of children. We don't, again, the Christians included women. It's also shocking to the Romans that they're including children. They wanted the children around. But so by the time of Emperor Julian, so Julian comes around, he's emperor in 361. He's one of the last Roman emperors to try to get rid of Christianity. He's post-Constantine, but he's like, okay, I don't like this. We need to get back to the good old-fashioned ways. And so he wants to try to revive the old Roman religions. And he decides that the way he needs to do it is to copy the Christians. Julian, who hates the Christians, says we need to copy them. So he gives this order that a fifth of the funds for the priests for the Roman temples needs to be given to the poor, and that the remainder be given to travelers and beggars. And he says, if you read the whole document, he's saying we need to do this because that's what the Christians are doing, and people are flocking to them.
Interesting.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. By the 4th century, so again, the time going into Constantine, basically throughout the empire, you had entire social service programs in most of their major cities, and they were able to do even more as they got more and more wealthy. People began to convert because they saw these things happening. Now, again, probably most of the upper crust of the Roman Empire are in the post-Constantine conversion, so I want to be careful about saying that. Julian, same guy I just mentioned to you, he said the impious, meaning they're not worshiping the right people. He called them the Galileans because Galilee is a part of the place where Jesus was. So if you don't really know your geography, it's that whole story. They support not only their own poor, but our poor, meaning non-Christian poor as well. There's a couple of plagues that occur early on. So we've obviously recently, the world, been through a pandemic, and we've seen our wonderful healthcare providers globally step into the equation. Well, that didn't exist back then. Guess who stepped in?
Christians.
The Christians did. They stepped right into the whole process. We have different letters from some of the different leaders of the time, basically urging their followers to keep bringing aid. One of these bishops, Dionysius, says that many of his people, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died instead. In other words, they went to serve these people. They were giving physical aid to these others. Remember, these people that they're aiding are not necessarily Christians, and the ones doing the aiding, they're not doctors and nurses. They've not been to medical school. They're not showing up as some sort of we have a healthcare program for you, or we have medicine that will aid you. They just saw people in need.
Showing compassion.
And they're showing compassion. And they're stepping in. Now, one scholar, and I haven't read the scholar, but I've seen some studies that included the scholar, and he's not a Christian, in studying this, said that these basic efforts of compassion may have cut the mortality rate of the plagues by up to 2/3.
Wow.
Now, we did, again, see this, not to raise a quirky point about in the pandemic, but as most of the world went into isolation, some negative outcomes of living in isolation emerged. And there was this concern, both in a social level, but even at the hospitals, of how can we ensure that our patients are doing well? And if we keep them in isolation, it turns out that, that there's a problem with that. 369, Basil of Caesarea will build what is considered the first hospital. 200 years later, Benedict, who maybe people have heard of the religious order of Benedictines, so it's kind of monks, he made a series of orders, like you have to do these things if you're going to come hang out with me and be in my group. And that included taking care for ill people, regardless of who. By the time you get to the 6th, 7th century, both monasteries and nunneries were known throughout cities as basically being proto hospitals, right? That anybody who came could get aid at the expense of the monks and the nuns. It was open to anybody. And so, here you have this healthcare system that emerges in the process.
And that's stuff that we take for granted today. Like, obviously that came from, I don't know, somewhere.
Yeah.
It did come from somewhere.
It did.
Somewhere very specific.
And sadly, we offload it to the civic society or to now the hospitals. A lot of hospitals are still connected to religious groups, and there's more than Christian groups now that are involved in that. But if you think about like healthcare programs or things that are around healthcare, a lot of those we have been, particularly with poverty care, have been sort of offloaded to the civic government. I'm not saying that those shouldn't exist there, but it's easy for people to think, oh, those are a natural outcome of governance or what governance does. And no, in fact, you could say governance began to do it whenever it began to happen. And a lot of that was 20th century because they were picking up the slack of the Christians who weren't doing it. Or it was Christians who were saying, it's too big for us to do it now on our own. It's the city's too large, something along those lines. But still, it's not like government has done it. It's like this idea of caring for someone. And I mean, just to be callous for a second, clearly we could lower a whole bunch of cost if we got rid of a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of arenas, environmental or economic or other things. And yet most everybody I know would say, no, we don't want people to die, even if they maybe are not necessarily, quote unquote, a value contribution to society. Well, where's that come from?
Because we have inherent worth.
That's right.
Yep.
What about education? My field, thing I like, right? Well, now I understand people might say this is not a singularly Christian thing because there certainly was education, and we know this. Absolutely is true. But in particular, when you look at the West, with the fall of the Roman Empire, you largely could say that the thing we call the Dark Ages, which is not what you should call the Middle Ages, but it's commonly used, that there was a decline and collapse of learning and knowledge. The preservation of that, which will ultimately lead to the university and college and education system we know today, comes specifically from Christianity. It was Christian leaders preserving knowledge, and they didn't say, oh, wait, this is something from Plato, we should burn this. This is something from some Egyptian, we should burn this. They saved everything. They saved it, obviously, in their monasteries and their nunneries. As certain leaders became Christians and they would have their fort or their castle, they certainly would have libraries and they made copies of things. When you do your Western civilization history, you end up with a man named Charlemagne. So when you run into Charlemagne, there's a moment of where he really wanted to revive learning and education. So he turned to who? He turned to the Christian church. Send me leaders so I can begin to build some schools and resuscitate learning so people can learn to read and write. Before Charlemagne, you have a very famous St. Patrick of Ireland. He is a crucial figure in the larger preservation of Western culture, but along the journey, one of the things that he does and the people who come after him, it's really more who flow out of his own life and the things that he does. We end up with another aspect of monks who kind of walk their way through Europe and who participate in a variety of things. They're really the ones who begin to build these monasteries, and some he started and some of his people after him started, that become communities for the arts, for learning, and again, open to anybody. Anybody could come to those places. Manuscripts were preserved, were copied, and in one sense, you kind of have the knowledge of antiquity saved through Christianity that will have a massive influence on what becomes of the Renaissance. And again, out of that, by the time you get to, say, the 10th and 11th century, you begin to have your first universities that emerge. Some of you know of Oxford or Paris, Bologna is the first in Italy. But these places are taking the idea of knowledge and saying, well, knowledge should be open to all people. And they're kind of leaning in on the foundation that Christianity provides for us. The Christians were opposed to slavery. They really were the first. Slavery is a whole massive topic. It could be a whole episode to itself, or probably not going to. It wouldn't be germane to the total thing we're talking our way through. But the short version is, as I tell people, slavery is on every continent, every tribe, every people group. Slavery is not about race. Slavery is about power, and where a group of people could enforce power over someone else, most often as a consequence of war, whether capturing a city or in a battlefield, someone has been captured, so they're kind of a trophy of the war, but in other ways. And you find nobody saying this is a problem. Nobody's saying this isn't right. In fact, it's assumed to be a natural. Even in the Greeks, go look at the Athenians. There's the kind of cradle of democracy. You don't have anybody there saying, oh, well, we shouldn't have slaves. Slavery was an understood component. And while I think it's fair to say someone could say, I wish Christianity was more, aggressive in declaring slavery itself wrong within its own ancient writings. Still, you look at, there's a writing by Paul, there's a writing by Gregory of Nyssa, who's post-biblical times, and then Patrick. Patrick's probably the champion. He's really the first one to be the standard bearer, saying, based on this idea of the human having worth, we shouldn't be here.
Right.
And while Christians will contribute tragically to the continuation of slavery, and just so everybody knows, slavery, sadly, is alive and well today. I hope you will take time and care to examine the things you purchase and see what organizations are near and around you, both internationally and locally, that are fighting against slavery of all its various types. So we don't end slavery with William Wilberforce and the kind of Civil War in the United States. It just moves underground and moves into different arenas. But the Christians were the first. Now today, plenty of people who are not Christians would oppose and actively seek to end slavery, and that should be applauded and championed. But if the idea needs to be restated that no one else on the planet is saying slavery is wrong, till the Christians come around and say, this isn't right. We shouldn't do it. This is not what God would prefer.
Yeah.
All right. There's a bunch of other stuff, but we're already out of time again. I love chatting with you about this stuff.
Yeah.
But if you think about things like championing of the arts, I kind of mentioned that with the monasteries, technological innovation, scientific and technology, and the science, when you look at the scientific revolution period coming out of the Renaissance, I want to say all, but I'll say nearly all of those key thinkers that we learned about in school were Christians. You probably weren't told that. And the reason why is simple, because they believed that they lived in a purposeful and orderly and a contingent world that could be examined and discovered through scientific method, the very world that they read in the Bible. So you have support for that. The idea of a religious liberty of conscience, eventually the idea of being a pacifist. These are all aspects that Christianity would suggest. Even the idea of separation of church and state. Now, that's a whole Gordian knot to try to get through. So maybe I should have mentioned, but I'll just say in general terms, our idea today in the 21st century that church and state should be separate, which will be core to what the Americans do, which we'll dig into in a couple of other episodes. It comes from the Christians, and the idea that government should be limited, that government should not be overpowering, which gets all the way back to where we were last episode with Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, which is what we're really arguing in that document, that the government is too strong and overpowering us, and so we now are going to break the bonds, as he said, and do our own thing. And the government we're going to construct, the first government, which is the Articles of Confederation in particular, was extraordinarily weak, and it was weak on purpose. It's not a flaw, it's a feature. We wanted it that way. Now, that's a whole conversation about civics and why did they do a constitution and James Madison, which we'll kind of look at that a little bit. Look, let me end here. As we look at the tension, as I look at the tension, and as we said, in our society, in the current 21st century culture, I think it's fair to say that society in the West and America is openly post-Christian. It's possible some could say anti-Christian. I don't know if that's fair to say that's for everybody. I think probably more people have a I don't care attitude. That's why they answer none. What religion are you? None. Don't really care. Not interested. However, I think from that then is an expression that would suggest, at least subconsciously, that they believe it'd be far better for society if we just didn't have the Christian faith. What I'm trying to point out as we go forward, that it's clear we need the Christian faith. Not just for the whole Jesus, go to heaven, which is not really the point anyway, but it's not that stuff. And it's not, oh, Jesus makes you better and you'll be better and you'll be nicer. Maybe. It's not that stuff. But just because of these ideas that we now all champion. I don't really know anybody who doesn't champion some of these ideas. And often, like I said earlier, sort of seems to come more from my progressive non-Christian side. Yeah, great. All that comes from this faith. Christianity is a massive net positive that if we lose it, it's not going to be helpful if we're trying to really get our unmoored boat at peril, our society into safe harbor. We want to be in that society, and we're going to have to find a way to work with that. So in the coming episodes, what I'm going to try and do is take us from where we are here, kind of looking at Western culture and coming to what did our first colonists, who were not Americans, who were part of the United States, citizens, what did they believe? What did they bring? Because they're going to embed these concepts within the structure. Again, make sure everybody's clear. I'm not saying we're going to end up at Christian nationalism. Christendom, we tried that. It's not good. But that from an embedded sense within our foundation of our civic society, they're going to think these things are useful. We're going to look at the things that they said and did, their successes and their flaws, kind of work our way out from there.
Looking forward to it.
All right, Matthew. I'll see you next time.
All right, Carl.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.